My friend Marcus has beautiful blue eyes. But you know what's strange? Both his mom and dad have brown eyes. How is that possible? Well, in this video, Mendel and his peers are going to help us answer this question. So in a previous video, we had seen one of Mendel's experiment. He took a pure tall pea plant and cross-fertilized it with a pure short pea plant and saw that the offsprings were all tall. He called them the F1 generation. This was shocking because we believed that, crossing them would give us some medium-sized plants, but we didn't. We got all tall. No short, no medium, all tall. And so Mendel was wondering whether these tall plants were the same as these pure tall plants as well. And what do we mean by pure tall plants? How do we find out whether they're pure or not? What is the meaning of pure? Pure means if you were to self-fertilize it. So if you self-fertilize a pure tall plant, then all its offsprings would be tall. Similarly, if you self-fertilize a pure short plant, all its offsprings would be short. That's what we mean by pure. So Mendel wanted to know whether these tall plants were also pure. So what he did is he said, let me take these F1 generation tall plants and self-fertilize and see what I get. And what he got was again a surprise. Now he got both tall and short plants in a specific ratio, roughly 3:1. And so the two important questions to answer over here is, in first case, why did we get all tall? Why wasn't the short trait seen at all? And another question is, in the second case, suddenly where did the short trait come from? Why it's in the ratio 3:1 always? It's as if the short trait has skipped one generation and then appears back in the next generation. What's going on? How do you explain all of this? All right, so to answer both these questions, Mendel comes up with two laws. The first one is called the law of dominance. So what does it say? So Mendel says, by looking at this, he guesses that when you cross the pure tall and the short plant, both the tall and the short trait got passed along. So these plants have gotten both the traits. Let me just write that down. They got the tall trait, which I'm going to represent with a capital T. And they also got the short trait from this plant, which I'm going to write as small t. And I'll tell you why I'm writing as a small t and not s, okay? So these plants contain both the traits, the tall trait and the short trait. But then you might be wondering, well, if they contain both the traits, then why are they all appearing tall? Why not the short trait? Why don't they appear short? Well, this is where Mendel guessed that maybe the presence of tall trait is dominating. Maybe the short trait is hidden in the presence of the tall trait. Again, let me just write that down. So what he's trying to say is that maybe the tall trait, this trait is dominant. That's why this is called the law of dominance, okay? He believes that this trait is dominant. And the short trait, he calls it recessive. Recessive. So the meaning of this is that recessive means the trait gets hidden in presence of dominant trait. So in presence of dominant trait, that trait gets hidden. And that's why it's not being seen. And that's why what you see is only the dominant trait. And so we say the dominant trait is getting expressed. The word expressed means that's what we end up seeing. Okay? So in short, to summarize, he's saying that both the traits are passed along. It's not a mix, nothing like that. Both are being passed along. It's just that one of them is dominant and that's what we see. The other trait is there, but it's hidden. In the presence of dominant, the tall trait, the short trait gets hidden. Now, of course, at this point, you might have some questions as to why the tall trait is dominant. Why not the short trait? Why isn't that dominant? Well, look, Mendel is just trying to guess what might be happening. So at this point, we don't know why one of the traits is dominant. What makes it dominant? Okay. Of course, later on, we'll study more about genes and how these traits gets passed and about DNA. That's where we'll get some clues about why certain traits become dominant and other becomes recessive or other becomes hidden. But as of now, let's not worry about why one of them is dominant. Okay, let's just accept this. All right. And if you're wondering why I wrote over small t and not S for short, this is the notation that we write today. For dominant traits, we use a capital letter. And for recessive traits, the hidden traits, we use the small letter of that same alphabet. Okay, so we use the same alphabet to represent both the traits. That's how we basically write it now. Okay, so even this plant is tall, has a tall and a short trait in it. Fine. So the next question is, how do we explain this? Why is it that when we self-pollinate this plant, we get both tall and short plants? And why is it we get in that same ratio, 3:1? What's the specialty of the 3:1? Where does that come from? Well, to answer this question, he comes up with another law. So let's move up, let's make some space and write down that law. So the second law that he comes up with to answer this is called the law of segregation. Segregation. And the word segregation over here, you can think of it as separation. Separation. Okay, so what's being separated? So Mendel guesses that when the gametes are formed in this plant, meaning the sperm cells and the egg cells are formed in the plant, they do not carry both the traits. He says that maybe when the traits pass into the gametes, they get separated, meaning some of the sperms will get a tall trait, some of the sperms will get a short trait. Similarly, when the eggs are formed in the ovary of the flower, they don't get both of them, they get separated, meaning some eggs will get tall traits, some eggs will get short traits. So let me just write that down this way. So imagine this is one of the sperms which is found inside the pollen grains. Of course, sperms may not look like this. Different plants have different kinds of sperms. Let me just draw it that way. So when that sperm is formed, some sperms will get a tall trait, but some sperms might get a short trait. And that's what he means by separation. The traits get separated when these sperm cells are formed. And similarly, when the egg cells are formed inside the ovary, so imagine this is an egg and the egg cell. So when the egg cell is formed, again, some egg cells will get the tall trait and some egg cells will get the short trait. Okay, law of segregation. All right, now how does this explain what happens? Well, now think about it. When we self-pollinate, what's happening? Basically, the sperms are fertilizing the eggs. Now, depending upon which sperm fertilizes which eggs, we might end up with a tall plant or a short plant. For example, if this sperm with the tall trait goes and fertilizes this egg with also a tall trait, then the fertilized egg will have both tall traits. And so when that plant grows, it's gonna be a tall plant. Okay, but there are other possibilities as well, right? So you know what I want you to do at this point? I want you to pause the video and see if you can find out how many such possibilities are there. And out of those possibilities, how many do you think will be tall and how many do you think will be short? And see if you can get that magic ratio, 3:1. So great idea to pause the video and see if you can figure this out now. Okay, hopefully you have tried. Let's see. So one possibility is this sperm fertilizes this egg, that's one. Or maybe another possibility is this sperm goes and fertilizes this egg. That's two. Another possibility is, third possibility is this sperm goes and fertilizes this egg. And the last possibility would be this sperm goes and fertilizes this egg. So total, we have 4 different possibilities. All right. And the way we usually like to write down that those 4 possibilities, or all the possibilities over here, we like to draw a box. So here's how we like to do. So let me just redraw those sperm cells. This is the tall sperm and this is the short sperm. Okay, it's not tall, it's just that it's a sperm that contains tall trait and the sperm that contains short trait. And let me draw the egg which contains tall trait here and the egg which contains short trait over here. And usually what we like to do is we like to draw a box like this. Okay. All right, now let's look at all the possibilities. If this sperm fertilizes this egg, then we get the fertilized egg has both tall traits, so TT. But if this sperm goes and fertilizes this egg, then we'll have one tall trait coming from the egg and one short trait coming from the sperm. Okay, if this happens, then we get the tall trait coming from the sperm and the short trait coming from the egg. And finally, if this fertilizes, then the fertilized egg will have both short traits. And these are the only 4 possibilities we have, right? So now let's look at what will happen when these plants grow. So when this plant grows, this one, it's going to be tall because both its traits are tall. When this plant grows, look, the law of dominance tells us that it is still going to be tall because this one will dominate. This is a recessive character, recessive trait. It'll hide, so this will dominate. So this is still going to be tall. What about this one? Even this is going to be tall. Remember, it doesn't matter from where the traits came, whether it comes from the egg or whether it comes from the sperm, that doesn't matter. As long as you have one tall trait, it's going to dominate, the plant is going to be tall. But what about this last one? Well, notice it doesn't have any tall traits. Both traits are recessive. When both traits are recessive, there is no tall trait to dominate, then and only then the plant is going to be short. And so right in front of you, you can now see what are the chances of getting tall. It is 3 out of 4. And what are the chances of getting short? It is 1 out of 4. And that's the reason we get the 3:1 ratio. And just to be clear, this does not mean that if you grow 4 seeds and the 4 plants, then you'll get 3 out of them will be tall and 1 will be short. You know, chances doesn't work that way. It just means that if you grow lots of plants, maybe hundreds of plants, and then you count them, then you will see about roughly 3:1 ratio will turn up for tall and short plants. Now, one question you might be having is, let's see what happens if you apply the same logic to the first generation. Let's apply the same logic to the sperms and the egg cells over here. What happens then? Well, let's see. This particular plant was a pure tall plant, which means it must have had both tall traits. Does that make sense? Why it must have had both tall traits? Let me use the same color. Why it must have had both tall traits? Because we know that if we self-pollinate this one, all its offsprings are going to be tall. We have already seen that. And that's only possible if both of them were tall. If one was tall and one was short, we would have had this now, we just saw. And similarly, with same logic, we can argue this one must have both short traits, right? That's the only reason it's looking short. If it had any tall trait, it would have been tall by the law of dominance. And so now think about it. Now, when a sperm from here goes and fertilizes an egg from here, the sperm will carry the tall trait, right? And the egg will definitely carry the short trait. And so when they fertilize, you'll get one tall, one short. Does that make sense? And even if it's the other way around, even if the sperm from here goes and fertilizes an egg over here, same thing. One tall, one short. Makes sense, right? And now you can use the same logic to explain what happens with the flowers also. So when you cross a pure purple flower with a pure white flower, in the first generation, we got all purple flower. Now, can you guess what was the reason for that? Well, we can guess that when they crossed it, both the purple and the white trait got passed along. But maybe the purple trait is dominating. And that's why we see all purple over here and no whites. And then later on, when you take one of those purple and you self-pollinate, by the law of separation, now we'll get the same ratio, 3:1. Makes sense, right? And so finally, can you now see how a recessive trait can skip one generation, but then come back in the next generation? Ooh, so can you now explain how my friend got blue eyes from his brown-eyed parents? Think about what traits might be dominating and what traits got passed along. Okay, let's see. Since we know that the blue trait got skipped at least one generation, we can guess that the blue trait must be a recessive trait. And so we can guess that my friend has both blue. And I'm writing small letter because it's recessive. If we had even one brown trait, then his eyes would have looked brown because brown, I'm guessing, must be dominant. So what must his parents be having? So his parents must be having one brown trait. That's what makes them brown eyes. But they must also be carrying a blue trait. The blue trait is hidden. It's recessive, it's hidden, and that's why it's not being expressed. And so when the zygote was formed, basically when fertilization happened, we can guess now maybe the sperm from the dad carried the blue trait and it went and fertilized the egg from the mom, which also carried the blue trait. The chances of that happening is pretty small. As we saw, it's a 3:1 ratio. We just saw the chances, but can definitely happen. And that's the reason why My friend ended up with both blue traits, giving him those beautiful blue eyes. That's it. So let's see if we can recall what we learned. Can you recall what dominant and recessive traits are? What the law of segregation is? And can you work out what would be the ratio of the offsprings if we cross a short plant with a tall plant which has both the tall and the short trait in it? And if you get stuck at any point, no worries, you can always go back and rewatch that part of the video.